our UCGIS environment, which is the criminal justice system, and that in a web services environment. So we've had a lot of activity in this arena in the last 5 years, a lot in the last 5 years. If you consume our services, you've gone through the pain with us, probably having to rewrite things and chase our services as we're changing them constantly. But I want to turn the time over to Mike. Mike Sadler is our program manager out there and has led this effort over the last, how long have you been there? 25 years?
About 25 years.
So, kind of looking at the end of it, huh?
Didn't know. During the period.
That's okay, Mike.
Thanks. So we're going to be talking about achieving a common vision for the use of web services. As we go through this, obviously it's going to have a slant from public safety's point of view, because that's where I have the most experience there. So first off, what are web services? Does everybody here use web services? Quite a few, yeah. So yeah, no. So some of you don't. Okay, great. So I guess at the lowest level, web services are server-to-server communication in order to pass data. So that's the low level. And then what are they used for? Well, to pass data. It could be large files. We work with large files, or individual transactions. So either one of those. And who produces them? Well, we produce a lot of web services because we service law enforcement transactions. So a vendor can write to our API, consume service, and get a driver's license or a motor vehicle query, etc. And then who uses them? We use them ourselves. So we have the UCGIS web front that consumes the same services that the vendor's applications do. Workforce Services consumes our services. Who else consumes our services? There's quite a few of us there. And you're with ORS? Okay. And the types of web services. So mostly we have RESTful services and then SOAP. Public safety, for the most part, uses SOAP web services. So there's quite a bit of difference to them. So the REST is not quite as formal and verbose. So here's a REST transaction for Yahoo that you can query one of their services. Versus a SOAP, as you can see, it's a lot more overhead with it, but there's a lot more that you can do with it, I guess, and a lot more formality to it. So SOAP is defined by a WSDL, a Web Service Description Language. You can usually get that from a browser if you have the permissions that you can click on that. Go to the service, !WSDL, and you can't see that very well, or not at all. But you can usually get that. So the WSDL defines all the operations and what the inputs, outputs are going to look like for the service. So it gives you, well, what the web service description is. Public safety, we've got two different kinds of services. So again, for the most part, they're SOAP, but are they synchronous or asynchronous? Most of them are synchronous, so a vendor or someone can consume our service and pass the information, say a name search for driver's license. We receive that, and we hang on the line, and then we go out and do the database work, format response, and send it back on the same conversation. So that would be a synchronous one. So asynchronous, we would receive the request for information, and then we'll give 200, okay, we got it, we'll talk to you later, and then that's the end of the conversation. Then we go out and do the work, and then we call back to the agency, so that means they have to have a server, a listener for that communication. We call back to them and then pass the information back. Within public safety, so that we don't have any spoofing as a transaction comes in, we have to pre-authorize an agency in order to get a conversation back. So we have to have we have a lookup table, so they communicate with us saying, oh, this is who we are. And then when we do the callback, we look up that table and say, now who we did call back to, what IP address, what URL, and so we don't trust what they say. That way someone doesn't hijack the conversation and we're sending information back to China or wherever. So we've got some requirements within our system here. And then standards. Of those that's doing web services, what standards are you using? Do you have some nationally standards, or have you defined them yourself? Public safety uses the national standards. So when we first started doing web services back in around 2000, 2001, just before the Olympics, we were using the Global Justice Data XML model, so GJXDM. That's the FBI came up with this, and for the justice community, here's some XML standards, and here's the data dictionary that goes along with that. And defined all the elements. And they also created what's called the IAPD, or the Information Exchange Packet Documentation. So this is everything that you need to know about that service. So it had both the business side as well as the technical side artifacts that you could use in order to consume that service, but know what that information meant when it came back to you. So not only just an element, XML element, but what that element meant. Then we had in 2001 we had 9/11, and shortly after that, Homeland Security was created. And one of the big things that came out of that in trying to increase security for the country was, hey, we've got to share data. And so they looked at what the GJXDM had, but they had a lot of elements of their own that they were sharing or creating in XML, but it didn't match up with Justice. But they wanted to combine those, and so they created NIM, the National Information Exchange Model. So they created a way to share the data. So we have core elements that everyone uses. So how many different ways can you say last name? Well, let's share that. Let's just create one way, and everybody use last name, and first name, and middle name, and date of birth, etc. But then if you're law enforcement, you may have charge. But if you were, say, emergency management, then you wouldn't have that. You would have maybe ETA, estimated time of arrival at an incident. So we have the core elements, and then we have individual elements, and together they make up NIM. So another agency can join. So in this case, Homeland Security, Department of Justice joined, but now Health could join, and they have name. That can be part of the core. Everybody uses the same name elements, but then Health can have their own elements as well. So standards, we need standards. Some of the NIM community today, Justice, the FBI, Intelligence, Immigration, quite a few there, and the list is growing. So now we've created these web services, but how do we get them out and let people know about them? I owe Gene a response to an email. Sorry, Gene. When I was building this presentation, so Gene says, hey, we've got these web services that we've built, but we don't just want to publish them out to the world. We want to just restrict them to our local partners. How are you guys doing it? I'm going to show him now, but then I'll have to drill down into more details with you. So there's UDDI, or UD, Universal Description, Discovery, and Integration. So that was the way, around 2000, 2003, they came up with a way to share services. This is more on a public note, I would guess, and so that you could say if you want to do a credit card validation, you would go to a broker that's saying, I want to do a credit card validation, and they would point you to that web service, and then you would consume that dynamically and then send your transaction. That's not how we're doing it at Public Safety. So we developed our own website, it's on Google Sites, that we can share the different transactions. So on the left-hand side here, we have all the different services, so criminal history, driver's license, motor vehicle, etc. And then they can drill down into that. We have documents that they can do, the IAPs or other documentation we have on how to consume those services. So that's actually working pretty well for us at this point in time.
So you're using Google App Engine in the background, or how it's authenticated by Google?
That's correct. He wants to know how we authenticate it. So yeah, it's through Google. So the vendors have to have a Google ID in order to join. It doesn't have to be a state ID, but they have to have Gmail anyways in order to access it. And then we are able to let them have different permissions or different access.
But are you using Google App Engine in the background, or are you
Just their sites. Well, Google, yeah. So Google Sites application there. So it's pretty easy to stand up for us.
Is there a drive to do EDI?
You know, we
Anywhere?
talked about it years ago, but there was never a big push. There was never a large enough group to really get it.
I think EDI is getting obsolete now, actually.
I think
It's seen its day.
So then, how to consume these services. So now we publish them. We're a Java shop with public safety here, so I've listed some of the tools that we use, but every development environment would have their own tools. Every modern development environment, I should say. We've got some that are not quite modern yet, so they have to hand code it. But one of the other tools that has proven useful to us is SOAP UI. Has anybody here used SOAP UI before? So it's not just useful for us. So with SOAP UI, you can actually hit the whistle and generate a client, and then submit that request and get the results back. So again, unless you've got really good eyes, then I'm going to have to stand a lot closer. On the left-hand side, we've got a driver's license query, and then on the right-hand side, we've got a driver's license response. So this just gives you, so we use it all the time, one, to test our services, or if someone says there's a problem, well, we want to see what's actually coming back, or as we're developing the client, we want to see what's coming back. So we use this all the time on both sides. So we get the response back, and we turn it into this. So this is the actual driver's license response on, you see this web card there. So again, we're consumers of our own web services. And yes, Yogi's on driver's license. And criminal history. So some of the problems we ran into with our web services is the different environments. So going back, we're using Neem for most of our services, and that's driven at this Utah level by federal grants. So we get grants, and part of the requirements is you have to use Neem. So we said, okay, so we struggled through it. And Neem was built by some doctorate students at Georgia Tech University. And so they're pretty far out there in their thinking, and the tools are just now catching up to that thinking. So Java's working okay. The .NET environment, Power Builder, some of the others are struggling with it at times, with the way it was designed. So we've got challenges there working with our vendors, our customers, consuming these services. And then we have different levels of expertise out there. So that sometimes has proven a challenge to us. And that here we're supposed to be doing programming, but we have to hold their hands in order to get them along so that they can service their customers, which ultimately are our customers. Security. We're all on security, right? So at the lower level there, using TLS or SSL or HTTPS in order to communicate over the state WAN or the internet there. Then certificates. We've used certificates in order to authenticate the servers so that as we reach out to another consumer or provider, then they know who's talking to them. We don't necessarily use that so much ourselves, Firewall, we only allow known partners into our services, kind of restrict the outside world, the Chinas, the Romanias, etc. And then we log every transaction that comes through. So we're able to see, this has helped us a lot in debugging when agencies are having problems. We can see what came in the door, we can see what went out. So we log everything for security. And then credentials. All of our services have credentials within it. So you need an agency, an ORI, and a login ID, and then a password for that. Because we log, every transaction stands alone, and every transaction is logged individually there. So we know who sent it. So we have different permissions within that. So as you consume the service, if you don't have a certain permission, you're not going to get the data.
Do you store all the credentials in your system or use UMD?
We do not use UMD, we use our own credentials. The big push for that is as we started this, so we've got over 10,000, going on 12,000 different users there, and most of them are non-state agencies. As we built the CGIS environment, there was a cost to use in UMD, and it wasn't as robust as perhaps it is today. So we developed our own, and it would be a major change to go away from that at this point in time.
You have to change CGIS policy as well because it's store passwords somewhere else.
That's correct. So there's security issues with that according to the FBI requirements there. But those credentials can be stored in the header or the body of the message, and we've done both. For the most part, it's in the header. And that's more the web service standard part of it. And it's kind of complicated again there. And then the other portion of that would be storing the credentials in the body. But we've done that mostly for some of these other tools that weren't able to generate the client for our header there. So she said, does the client manage their password, or do we manage it? So it's a UCGIS password. It can be used at any point in the system there. So if I'm a highway patrolman and I'm using a vendor application out in the car, he sends his UCGIS credentials to his application server. That server forwards them on to us. We authenticate and authorize. But that same officer can go to the office and log into the UCGIS web front and use the same credentials. So we manage their BCI are the stewards of the UCGIS system. They manage the credentials there.
Between servers, do you have password managed? Between servers, or only use certificate between servers?
When we do the certificates, that's only between servers. It doesn't have anything to do with the users.
So these credentials are only for end users, not for the servers.
That's correct. But we do have batch jobs, I guess, that consume our services as well. But they have just another log on, just like any individual user there. Other questions?
What do you do password maintenance, forget password,
So what do we do about maintaining the passwords, etc.? They forget them. So there's different levels on the UCGIS side of things. So we have what's called a Terminal Agency Coordinator, or a TAC. That's BCI's, Public Safety's, contact with each individual agency. They have the ability to reset a user's password within a certain amount of time, depending on, in a 30-day window, they can reset them. Otherwise, they have to contact BCI. BCI has a help desk, and they can reset them if they need to. Those agencies also request a log on for the person, and they pass the proper information. Request the different levels of permissions that they have. So, can you give them the driver's license, motor vehicle, criminal history, etc., and then take them away as well. Once they're done, once they no longer work there, they send in a request and say, please cancel this login ID. In keeping with best standards, a minimum or an 8-character password, a robust password, 90 days, and then you have to change it. Other questions? So that's a little bit about web services. So how do we go about creating a common vision, or a shared vision for these web services? Well, if we wanted a common vision, we're going to have to define the need for sharing data. Does it have to be real time? Could it be a batch mode? If it is real time, we've got a lot of that experience. Define the partners. Who has the data and who needs to share it, who needs to consume it. And we need to define the type of services to use. Is it going to be SOAP? Going to be REST? Again, we're more of a SOAP shop, so we're clean. Sorry.
I was going to ask you why you leaning towards so when to REST. I mean, you can do the same XML formatting with REST too. Is there any particular reason?
A lot of it was driven from the federal level. So again, we got grant dollars and they gave us direction on where to go, and it was SOAP, and we just embraced it. I don't know that REST was as robust or as prevalent as it is today when we first started. Pardon?
I was just saying when you started, REST really wasn't near where it was now a decade ago.
Right, exactly. And then sync versus async. And then define the use of standards. So need has a lot of power, but it's pretty complicated as you get into that. Would need be a way to go? Again, a lot of different agencies are using that. Would it make common sense to be a need shop? And then how are we going to share the availability of the services with our partners? How are we going to announce that? And then define the levels of security. So if we can define it, I'm a real visual person. If anybody works with me, you know I can't wait to get up and draw on the board. And, if we can define it, we can build it. Right? So here's a little plug for Mark. Dave can take this back. So all of these things that we've been talking about fit right in with the DTS pillars here. So we're talking about innovative technology, right? This is cool stuff, and it really works. Exceptional customer service. We're doing that today. We're providing a lot of good service for our customers, and our customers are wide across the country, actually. Employee success, we talked a little bit about the levels of expertise. We can raise that level and help the employees and the agencies and the state. And then information security, we touched on that. We want to be secure. Questions? Go ahead.
For your web services, do you use tools to automate or test them? How do you do the testing and make sure the web services perform the way that you?
So I'm going to let some of the web services folks address that. So for the most part, we have used some, is it SOAP load, or what was that SOAP? Load UI in order to test our services. A lot of times we test them in-house and then test them with our vendors and then test them in production.
Using sort of integration or continuous integration process with building and performing testing.
Most of our development is done on something called a service bus. It really doesn't tie well to continuous integration at this point. So we're not using that for anything on that part.
So we do use that in our driver's license application. It leads more to that. A lot of these services are standalone services. If you want a driver's license, you get a query, then you get driver's license information there.
One of the painful things with services is to maintain versioning. How do you maintain versions? Like if you move on to the next one, and if there are still people who want to use the older one and don't want to get on the new one.
That's a good question. Everybody here, how do you do versioning, he said. So we add a date to the end of the service there. So as we move forward, and we're experiencing this exact scenario with our Citation Web Service. So we built the first one that allows the law enforcement to submit a citation electronically, and it finds its way all the way to the courts in 2009. Well, then we had a 2010 version, we had two of them in 2012, now we got a 2014 version. We still have people hanging back on the 2009 version. And ultimately, we've deprecated those, we'll be shutting those off soon. And implementing the 2014 on the 1st, so next week.
So within the code base, how do you maintain it? Like, you have separate services or?
They are separate
They are
services.
going to be separate.
That's correct, so that we can run concurrently. Good question.
Is that also mean on the different versions that you have different formats in the database for the different versions?
Yes. So with the new citation service that we have, there's expanded elements that are coming across and being stored in the database. So yes, it reflects those, and oftentimes that's what drives a different version.
Do you find a process that works well for keeping everybody on the same version? Besides just showing off?
No. So if someone's got some ideas, we'd be willing to talk. But ultimately, it comes to that. As we implement, so we're transitioning from the old proprietary HP box that we had. We have socket messaging, and we're transitioning into this new SOA environment and web services. And we still have people hanging back. So we give ultimatums saying, hey, we're cutting this off as of this date. You're going to have to do soon. So they do or die. Some of them have died a little bit, but they've come back, and most of them are doing. So that's always going to be a challenge, I think, because there's a cost to the vendors and to the agencies to keep up with this, but there's a cost to us to stay behind. So it's always going to be a challenge. Other questions?
I saw that you said you use both synchronous and asynchronous communication. Web services are generally stateless, right? There is no state password. So how do you do this? How do you maintain a session?
So when they, just like it,
calls are asynchronous, right? I mean, not asynchronous web service calls are stateless. So you make a call, you get back something you've done.
right,
The next call is treated independently. So
That's
how do
correct.
So you said you maintain a session.
no, just they make a call, they hang on the line while we do the database work, and then we send the response back, just like any web service or web front application there.
Yeah, but for your asynchronous, how do you do it? Do you need to
So in the XML that's being passed on the asynchronous services, we have a reply to element, and they provide the URL that we can call back to. And then we store that off, because we log everything, right? And then, so they send it, we reply with the 200, okay, we got it, we'll talk to you later. Then we go out and do the work, and then we look up that URL, then we look up our table and say, is this who they really say they are? If it is, then we call back to them. Again, now they have to have a listener on their side.
They also pass us a message ID, so that when they pass that same message ID back, they know which request to get higher.
They can marry it up, that's correct. Thanks, Ryan.
So synchronizes, asynchronizes that most for read only or read and write?
Most of our transactions are read-only. However, we're building some applications that consume web services to do CRUD, so create, read, update, delete.
Right, for a long process, you need to do it synchronized. You don't want to hold on to it. You want to say, okay, give you a message, you get back to it, then you can cross it, and you just back results.
So a lot of what drove our asynchronous transactions were communicating with other systems. So the first one was NCIC. NCIC is the National Crime Information Center run by the FBI. And so they're an asynchronous process themselves. So that we didn't have them hanging on the line because we didn't know how long it was going to take for them to respond. We built a service that you send it to us, we'll acknowledge it, we'll send it to them, get a response back, and then we'll call you back when we have the answer. We've used it in the past, but not quite a lot anyway. Low UI, right?
Why the dependency on the Google side? I mean, is it something you want to keep, or is it something that you will change later on for the authentication?
For the Google site, it was easy for us to stand up, and so we did. We needed a way. We used to have a website that Public Safety or BCI maintained, and anybody could hit. And it was fronted by UMD, but this particular directory wasn't. We were monitoring Anonymous, and they hit upon that site and were commenting on some of our documents there. So we said, whoa, hold on here.
Do you expose your website to anybody who has Gmail or you still utilize restrictions to make sure?
Only known partners is who we expose our information to.
Through IP restrictions?
That's correct, through IP restriction on the firewall there.
How do you guarantee that there's no IP spoofing?
Well, we can't guarantee that. I guess there's just the combination of the IP address and then the credentials within the service, and then them having to know how to do the service in general, yes.
So you talked about using certificates earlier. You guys actually train certificates between servers so that they generate and say, this is a certificate that identified by server. That way, spoof-wise, they have to actually spoof that as well, or is that not?
That's correct, but that's not how we're doing it. So the one that I can think off the top of my head that we're doing certificates is talking back to the feds, again, to the FBI. They have what's called Index, National Data Exchange. So they've got a database that we can query, but they said, well, we want to authenticate that server, not just your credentials that you're going to send us. And so we set up that PKI with them.
You said you're doing IP filtering. Now, are you doing that yourself with your own firewalls? Is that a state one? Is the state actually posting that for you, or else?
It's in at campus, Public Safety has their own firewall in front of the applications there.
Okay, so it's an internal firewall, but the state firewall just let them try.
That's correct.
We had the same discussion.
Okay, yeah, so we tell them, okay, for this server, allow the traffic in and we'll manage it. But for other servers, then we want them to stop it at the perimeter there. Other questions? I hope this has been beneficial. That's it.